Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. We are from Critic Group 1 and we would like to present our findings on her Gen Quiz case study. The agenda included in our presentation are: first, global public view on gene editing technology; second, germline gene editing necessary or not; germline gene editing, Islam and other religions view; and future potential of CRISPR technology in medical world. The first agenda that will be presented is global public view on gene editing technology. Due to recent scientific developments in human gene editing and the range of ethical and governance issues, an international summit was organized by the National Academy of Sciences and National Academy of Medicine in Washington, D.C. in 2015. Many countries contributed in this summit, and here are some issues discussed throughout the session. USA government policies and issues stated that researchers who want to use this technology must seek an advice from Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee and local research subjects review bodies. As for Europe, they prohibit genetic engineering in germline or changing makeup of later generation. In German Embryo Protection Act prohibited artificial alteration of gene in human germline and use of human gene cell with artificially edited gene for fertilization. Besides, Nigerian government showed their interest with human gene editing because they have the highest number of sickle cell cases in the world. But their clinical and research capacity needed to be improved first. Meanwhile, manipulation of gene in human zygote, gamete, and embryo for reproduction purposes is strictly prohibited in China. Based on this summit, intensive basic and preclinical research is clearly needed and should proceed, which the researchers should not use gene-edited germline to establish a pregnancy. The clinical use of germline editing can be proceed if relevant safety and efficacy issues resolved with appropriate understanding and balancing of risk, potential benefits, and alternatives. The clinical use of human gene editing also can be conducted if there is broad consensus about appropriateness of the proposed application and if there is appropriate regulatory oversight on human gene editing. However, there are also many countries that have legislative or regulatory bans on germline modification. Second International Summit on Human Gene Editing was organized in 2018 in University of Hong Kong. Topics in this summit included the potential benefits and risks of human gene editing, ethical perspectives, and regulatory policy considerations. Based on this summit, genome editing research in USA invokes three activities which are oversight, approval, and consent. There is also arguments against germline genome editing from Netherlands representative due to consideration of the autonomy of a child, societal equity, and possible misuse of human gene editing. Tetsuya Ishii from Japan stated that human germline genome editing has a systemic impact on human rights due to current uncertainty about outcomes and the inability to obtain consent from someone not yet born. As for China, genome editing of human embryos is likely to progress to the point that it could be used if scientific and social issues were better understood and addressed. The requirement of genome editing includes special regulations on applying genome editing in human reproduction, a licensing system, capacity building for review boards, and enhanced review for germline genome modifications. Here are responses toward her study during International Summit on Human Gene Editing 2018. The objections toward the study include lack of oversight and transparency in development, review, and conduct of clinical procedure, the inadequacy of the parents' informed consent, the existence of alternatives for preventing HIV infection, the possibility that the genome editing will cause other health problems, sources of funding for the research, inadequate medical indication and poor design study protocol, failure to meet ethical standard for protecting welfare of the subject, and her study is an evidence of a failure of self-regulation by the scientific community.
In my part, I'm going to talk about gene editing, whether it's necessary or not. Before we could know whether it's necessary or not, we need to discuss about the potential risks and the potential benefits of germline gene editing. For the potential risks, it has two kinds of risk: the medical risk that comes with it and the societal risks that comes with it as well. For the medical risk, there are several errors that may happen due to the editing, and it may cause negative effects for the future individual. These kind of negative effects are extremely hard to predict. That's why it causes a huge risk. However, not a lot of individuals are meant to use GGE, so the risk at the level of population must be put into perspective. The societal risk, that there are several people that may use GGE for genetic enhancement that is non-medically related. Having said that, GDE has been said that it is not necessary for clinical perspective because of the presence of PGD followed by embryo selection in the context of IVF. However, there might be cases where GDE is very beneficial, and this should not be taken for granted. One of them is that there are some cases that PGD cannot be an option, for example, in life-threatening diseases. And sometimes it's very hard to be particularly possible to prevent polygenic disorders. So the European Society of Human Genetic and the European Society of Human Reproduction and Embryology argued that while somatic gene editing can be very useful in many clinical cases, germline gene editing has certain advantages like prevention of multi-organ disorders and multi-generational preventive effects. Having all this said, our group believes that the research on GGE should not be banned completely, assuming that the overall risk of GGE is scoring within the risk of arising from mutational rates of normal reproduction or already established ARTs. The therapy can be considered as scientifically feasible. And our group provided two perspectives. The first one is human rights law, which states that every individual has the benefits to enjoy this scientific progress. And the prohibition of GGE therapy, it violates this kind of advantage for individuals to enjoy the highest attainable standards of physical and mental health. And the second perspective is the Islamic perspective. There are a lot of sick people in the world and children that should be entitled of the care that the state provides. However, the modification for the betterment of humanity within the prescribed limits is permitted, as God is aware of all and even about its procedures, since nothing is happening but in accordance to his will. It should also be allowed if it's declared safe and efficacious. Also, developing technology that has zero risk is almost impossible. Therefore, Islam teaches us that harm should not be eliminated with another harm. Having all this said, the research on GGE must be strictly, responsibly conducted under these 5 umbrellas. The first one is that the use of GGE could only be considered when after safety and efficacy issues are resolved, and there should be a huge need to international consensus on how human GGE should be regulated. The third one is that the limits that the germline intervention to treat or prevent certain serious incurable hereditary diseases only, and the fact that it should be based on necessity, which means that if GGE becomes unnecessary when there are equally effective therapy available. And the last one is that any clinical application of GGE should be preceded by rigorous preclinical scientific testing and evaluation using in vitro tests and in vivo models. In this case, it is established that the use of GGE should not be necessary because the modified CCR5 to prevent developing of HIV transmitted could hardly be justified as therapeutic intervention, and there are other safer and more effective alternatives available in this situation, like washing sperm off HIV-infected father. And this research also was performed without appropriate risk and safety risk assessment. That's why we condemn this kind of act, because it was unnecessary.
Next, I'll be explaining about germline gene editing based on the Islamic perspective and other religions' view. The first one is the Islamic perspective. Previously, as presented by the presenting group, they have mentioned details about all the Islamic law and principles in order to decide this case is ethical or not. They have mentioned details about the Maqasid al-Shari'ah, the 5 foundations of Islamic law, which involve the protection of faith, life, lineage, intellect, and property. Next, we would also like to add another principle from the Qawaid Fiqhiyah. This principle should all be met before approval of an experiment like this case. The first principle is the intention. The intention of this research is achieved as it aims to protect the embryo from HIV. The next principle is the certainty and injury. However, these two principles were not satisfied as they require a strong scientific certainty of the procedures and also the evidence of the safety. Next principle is the necessity. There are actually more established and proven safe alternatives to protect the HIV transmission from the father. Therefore, this principle is not met. Next is the custom. This principle was not achieved as the social context of using any contemporary technology should be taken in consideration. Therefore, according to the Islamic perspective, germline changes are rejected until the 5 principles are fulfilled. In this case, there was clearly no justification or support for it according to the Muslim jurisprudence laws. Therefore, our groups agree with the presenting group statement that the Islamic perspective rejects the actions of He Jiankui. Next, we add a few views from other religions. The first one is the Buddhism perspective. The Buddhism, in principle, has no difficulty to cope with any new scientific achievements and advancements in the treatment of diseases, which is actually bring hope for the cure of incurable disease. The Buddhism sees that the Human Genome Project and genetic engineering technologies as important ways to relieve human suffering and promote human well-being. The Buddhism also thinks that an embryo is human, thus possesses human dignity and human rights at the time of conception. Therefore, there are 2 opinions from the Buddhism perspective. The first opinion that supports the actions is that most Buddhists concerned with the relief of suffering, and germline therapy actually ensure that the future generations do not suffer from genetic conditions. However, there is another perspective that germline therapy are against because it considered as a violence if it was to negatively affect the future generations. Next is from the Jewish perspective. The Jewish perspective on genetics shows a striking paradox. There are no other religious group that has been more receptive to genetic medicine than the Jews. Therefore, there are 2 opinions from the Jewish perspective. The first one is that most Jews argue humankind will be acting as stewards, which they develop treatments that would ensure the future generation do not suffer from genetic conditions and disease. They also believe that embryos that are not implanted in the womb do not have a full human status. So genetic manipulation of embryos actually is supported for future generations. However, there's also an opinion that some Jews consider the unknown risk of the germline therapy is too great. Therefore, they are against the actions of germline therapy as it brings the unknown risk to the future generation. Next, from the Christian perspective, most gene editing researchers see the creation and destruction of embryo as an intrinsic necessity, which brings to a point that many Christians find this very unethical. The goal of healing or enhancement or the technique being used are the factors for their evaluations, whether this action is ethical or not. There are 2 opinions came from the Christian perspectives. Some Christians argue that scientists act as stewards, which develop treatments to ensure the future generations do not suffer from genetic disease, similar to the Jewish perspective. But there are also many Protestants believe that embryos younger than 14 days old do not have full human status. Therefore, they support the genetic manipulation of embryos that do not suffer in future. However, there's an opinion that some Christians would consider the unknown risk of germline therapy also to be too great, for they're against the action of germline therapy as it will bring an unknown risk to future generations. And also some Christians concerned that this expensive type of treatment only available for the wealthy people, and it goes against the Christian teachings on justice. Lastly, from the Hinduism perspective, the Hindus believe that each person has a non-physical self, or they call it the Atman. Some Hindus believe that the Atman enters a human life at the moment of conception, meaning that they believe that every embryo has an Atman. This affects their views about genetic engineering or therapies involving embryos, which means they are against it, since it will be viewed as harming a living thing. To summarize, the other religions' view on germline gene editing are aligned with the Islamic perspective. If it brings more harm than benefit, then it is considered unethical.
So, I would like to explain the last agenda for these slides, which is the future potential of CRISPR technology in medical world. CRISPR technology wants to cure incurable diseases, particularly people with genetic diseases, by correcting mutations at the DNA level. In the first trials, CRISPR-based therapy done by Editas Medicine to volunteer patients with Leber congenital amaurosis and a genetically inherited diseases. They do the procedure via injection of CRISPR-based medicine directly to the cells in infected eyes. According to Editas Medicine, CRISPR edit is permanent, but the drug will only affect the one who undergoes the therapy and not pass on to the next generations. The research of CRISPR gene editing on sickle cell anemia, beta thalassemia, cancers, and others are still in progress. To what extent that CRISPR technology can be permitted in basic and preclinical biomedical research and in translational and clinical medicine. So in basic and preclinical biomedical research, it depends on how the status of the embryo is appraised. However, the ban also could save it from potentially unjust legal research-related harms, even if the research is justified because of its potential benefit to the embryo itself or to the others. The embryo as such cannot give informed consent at the time of the research since the entity is not sufficiently developed. But from the research, it could experience potentially life-altering consequences. It might be good or bad that may extend throughout the lifespan and future generations. In translational and clinical medicine, the heritable germline editing might present additional risks because it involves not only the research participants but also potentially their descendants. Here are the benefits and risks of using the CRISPR technology. In basic and preclinical research, the benefits are it becomes the novel drug targets, it increases the gene editing efficiency, it able to identify the novel signaling, regulatory, and developmental pathways. In contrast, for the harms, the experimentation involving human embryos is controversial and illegal in some countries. It may become a potential for privacy and confidentiality breaches. In translational and clinical medicine, it is able to modify the pathological genes, and it becomes the novel therapeutics and fertility applications. For the risk, it can cause serious injury, disability, or death to research participants or their offspring, and also it can be misuse of CRISPR technology. The international regulation regarding CRISPR, most statements hold the heritable germline experimentation should be prohibited currently. All the statements from the Netherlands 163, the United Kingdom 164, Spain 165, and the United States 9 suggest that editing could be permissible if certain requirements were satisfied. The NASEM Committee's report on germline editing specified that the following provisions must be met for human heritable germline research to commence, which are the absence of reasonable alternatives, the restriction to prevent a serious disease or condition, the restriction to edit genes that have been convincingly demonstrated to cause or to strongly predispose to that disease or condition, and etc. However, for some authors, this is ethically objectionable because it fails to respect the moral status of embryos, an issue that has been discussed since the early days of the debate on embryo research. For instance, research with human supernumerary embryos, i.e. embryos created during IVF to establish a pregnancy that will no longer be used for this purpose, is often considered more ethically acceptable than research with human embryos created specifically for research purposes. So, in conclusion, based on the presentation just now, we agree with the stand from the presenting group with our justification from the findings from the global public view, the other religious perspectives, and the potential of using CRISPR technology for the other purpose in medical world. So here are the references. So that's all from our group. Thank you for listening.